Okay, so here's my very brief introduction to the predictive mind. I think the best way of understanding the predictive mind framework is to kind of start from thinking about a really classical view, and perhaps quite intuitive view of how we understand perception. So on a kind of traditional kind of Marian framework, the way that, say, visual perception works is we get this very impoverished input data on our retinas, and gradually, as the information flows inwards into the brain, or up the neural hierarchy, the representation of the world is gradually refined. And the important thing is that the information, the important information about the world, is flowing inward. Now, the simplest way, I think, of understanding the predictive mind framework is that it flips the direction in which information can be thought of as flowing, particularly in kind of perceptual systems. So rather than building up a model of the world incrementally based on the input, the brain actively predicts what input it expects to get from the world. So it's top down rather than bottom up in this sense. You might think that's weird. Why, if we're just kind of, how do we get anything from the world? How do we make sure we're in contact with the world if we're doing all of the predicting from the inside, or if some internal thing is doing the predicting? Important feature is that the information that flows inwards is the prediction error, right? The discrepancy between what our model of the world sort of predicts about what the inputs from our sensory receptors will be, and the actual input from those sensory receptors. So that's the kind of general picture, and it's kind of said to be very revolutionary, and for various reasons many people have seen this as a kind of grand unifying theory of how the mind and brain works. So a slightly more in-depth picture. So this is going on not just in terms of our visual perception, but in all our different sensory modalities, and perhaps also interoceptive things like the internal states of our body. And really importantly, this is done in a series of layers, right? So we still have this notion of a hierarchy, with each layer in the hierarchy predicting the input it'll get from the layer below. The lowest level predictions, the predictions about what's going to be going on right at the sensory periphery, are going to be highly spatially and temporally precise. Whereas when we get to higher up levels in the hierarchy, according to the approach, we get increasingly abstract or categorical predictions. And the sort of general idea is that the fundamental imperative of the brain is to minimize the overall prediction error, or free energy, on average over time. So that's kind of the basics of how perception is understood on this predictive processing framework. Importantly, though, there's this additional feature of attention and how that relates to the notion of precision. So this might be something that is quite alien to a lot of us now, but imagine that you're in a very busy, noisy, crowded room. In that kind of scenario, the input that you get from your auditory receptors is likely to be less useful, less precise, right? Because it's very noisy. Similarly, you might think if you're in a very foggy environment, right? The input from your visual receptors is likely to be imprecise. So we don't want to pay too much, we don't want to give too much weight to those inputs in correcting the model. And this is where attention comes in. So the idea is that we also have these predictions of the sort of quality of the error signals that we're receiving, right? So we don't merely kind of make predictions about what the content will be, but also how precise they'll be. And when the input is expected to be particularly precise, perhaps something like very bright circumstances, you're focally attending to it, those error signals that come from your receptors are going to be strengthened. And when the input is expected to be noisy, the error signals, because we predict them to be less useful, will be dampened. And so according to the proponents of predictive processing framework, this is just what attention is, right? Attention is just the weighting of the precisions within the model. Now, that kind of makes a lot of sense in the perceptual domain in some ways, but what this also does is it provides a kind of more general mechanism through which we can kind of, our brain can tune the balance between top-down and bottom-up influence which can be particularly important when we think about imagination. Okay, so how is imagination likely to be explained within this kind of framework? And this is where, I mean, Sam and I kind of encountered difficulties because it's actually much less clear than we'd hoped when we were asked to write a piece on this. But Andy Clark and Michael Kirchhoff have both written very interesting stuff on this. So Andy says, the predictive mind framework suggests a deep unity between perceiving and imagining. In later work, he says, perception, at least as it occurs in creatures like us, is co-emergent with something quite like imagination. So we end up with perception and imagination being much closer tied than perhaps in previous ways of understanding things. Clark also says, animals capable of forming rich, world-revealing percepts are, if the predictive processing story is on track, animals that understand their worlds and that are poised to imagine them too. So kind of merely being able to have rich, world-revealing percepts seems to be sufficient for being able to engage in imagination. This seems like quite a strong claim. Michael Kirchhoff has also written on this, and he says, the predictive processing framework may be said to represent a departure from the received view by depicting perceiving and imagining as deeply unified and overlapping. Perception and imagination are the psychological results of the brain endogenously generating its own sensory inputs top down. So roughly the idea here seems to be, look, we've got this framework, and maybe something like imagination is just this endogenous top-down generation of content that can then be kept in check by the error signals that we get from the world. And on this kind of picture, it seems imagination is playing a much more significant role, at least if we understand imagination this way, than most traditional theories would have it, where perception and imagination are perhaps kept very separate. And I think what's really interesting, this does seem in many ways to kind of demystify the imagination, right? You might have thought, look, the imagination is somewhat mysterious, precisely because it seems to be endogenously generated experience, in contrast to the experience we get by interacting with the world. So one way of looking at it is that imagination becomes less mysterious because this kind of endogenously generated content, endogenously generated top-down predictions, are fundamental and ubiquitous within the predictive mind framework. These top-down endogenously generated predictions are everywhere. So a slogan of proponents of the predictive mind is that perception is controlled hallucination, which also seems to be quite a good way of describing imagination, perhaps. Sam and I think, though, that there's a bit of a problem that comes up here, what you might call the problem of ubiquity. Can't see the wood for the trees. It seems like, look, imagination becomes too ubiquitous on this picture, because if imagination is everywhere and is involved in all of our mental activity, then we lose sight of what the distinctive mental faculty or distinctive kind of mental ability of imagination and imagining is. Perhaps you might think that imagery is ubiquitous, but I think there's good reasons to think imagery is not the same thing as imagination. There may be a way of getting around this problem, though. So often the way proponents of predictive processing talk about imagination is something closer to decoupled experience. So what do I mean by that? Remember, right, we have this extra ingredient of attentional precision weighting in the predictive processing framework. Now, if you're imagining something, kind of by definition, like what you're imagining is very likely not to be the same thing you're looking at, not the same thing that you're currently seeing. So it makes sense to try and dampen the error signals that one gets from the world. We expect low precision with regard to what we're imagining when we're looking at the world. And you might even do this, I mean, there's many ways of doing this, but one way of doing this is of getting very, of diminishing the kind of quality of our visual information we're receiving is simply by closing your eyes, right? So by closing your eyes, you might bring about a state of affairs where we expect very low precision information to be coming from the eyes. And that by then stopping the error signals coming from the world, perhaps the rest of the predictive processing hierarchy is able to kind of do its thing without being controlled and kept in check by the world, allowing us to imagine scenarios that aren't what's right in front of our eyes. But we think there's another bit of sort of small problem with this. There's lots more you can say on this, but I'll try and keep it very brief. Look, imagining arguably differs from things like dreaming, daydreaming, mind wandering, or hallucinating, in part because it's deliberateness, many other ways too. Now, I think the predictive processing framework, and this is what a lot of the proponents will say, it does account for things like dreaming, daydreaming, perhaps hallucination, in terms of this dampening down the sensory signals and letting the predictive model go wild. But it's in doing so, it seems to struggle to explain imagining as a form of deliberate mental action. Imagining is something we often do to achieve various goals. Therefore, imagination needs to be controlled in some way so it reaches the goals we want it to. And this seems to come back to this problem, right? The proponents of predictive processing say perception is controlled hallucination, but the control on the model comes from feedback via error signals from the world. Imagination is supposedly going to be accomplished by dampening the signals from the world. But then the question is, what keeps control of the imagination? How can imagination differ? And how does imagination differ from hallucination or dreaming? So that's a couple of problems me and Sam have thought about. I think there'll be loads more interesting stuff that the other panelists have to say, though. Few questions to think about, maybe, or not think about, doesn't really matter. How, if at all, does the predictive mind framework help in explaining imagination? Is imagination an anomaly for the predictive processing framework? Is there something missing from what's supposedly this grand unifying theory? And maybe is imagination actually that different from these things like dreaming, mind wandering, or hallucination? Right, that's enough of me. I'll hand over to our lovely panelists. So just before we get chatting in that, in terms of the panelists discussing, I'm going to be running after the panelists have said some things like a normal Q&A. So just send me a private message if there's something you'd like to interject with in the discussions once the panelists have had their first say.
Great, thanks so much, Max. So Dan, are you okay to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first.
Great, thanks so much. Take it away.
Apologies if I cough or splutter at all. I'm a bit ill, but yeah. So I generally agree with Max and Sam. I think the kind of predictive coding accounts of imagination, they're a bit too conceptually broad. And I think what's perhaps interesting to me, at least, is that I find that it's plausible to suggest that, you know, imagination to various degrees can be dampening a precision error circles of predictions. But the problem, you've got to kind of account for the emergent complexity that kind of arises out of these different dampening or sharpening of precision signals on top of the predictions the brain is making. And, you know, it depends partly on what level in the brain the kind of dampening is occurring. If it's a low level of visual perception, you know, maybe it's more likely to be kind of hallucination as imagination. Or if it's a very high level dampening, maybe much more likely to be a kind of more broadly, you know, broadly spaced temporal or higher order kind of imagination. That's right. But the problem is that when you consider that this kind of emergent complexity might arise out of this basic principle of prediction error minimization and precision weighting, that there's kind of two things I think that predictive coding theorists have to pay attention to. One is that there's actually a broad coherency between this kind of explanation and other explanations of similar cognitive phenomena, and kind of a due attention to the physical constraints from the external world upon these kind of processes that lead to imagination in the first place. And we've heard a lot today about embodied cognition and how that relates to imagination, and that's a good example. So I won't go too long, but a quick case study I kind of been thinking about the last 2 days is when we compare imagination with memory and memory recall and how this relates to the predictive coding framework. So in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a fair few people who suggested that episodic memory is strongly linked to predicting imagining the future and things like that. But what's interesting, I think, is when you compare different kinds of predictive coding accounts about both imagination and memory. So for the predictive coding theorists, imagination, typically dampening signals to produce less grounded predictions that in the brain, whereas memory might be dampening or sharpening precision error signals in order to confirm or disconfirm the predictions you're making about the world. But what's interesting here is that basically we've got the same process. So what is really distinction between memory and imagination? If they're both different kinds of recall that are operating in different ways. Well, the first is that you have to obviously draw a distinction between what memory and imagination are in reference to the external world. Imagination typically might involve things that don't actually occur, whereas memory, we are trying to recall usually events or things that are right about the world that we've experienced. But the second kind of thing is also about kind of how these two can mesh depending on, and I think this is where the big problem comes when we need predictive coding theorists about imagination. You need to make this kind of a more fine-grained account of different kinds of imagination and how these relate to predictive coding hierarchies. Because if you take, for example, what it means to imagine a future event that's just about to occur. Now, in some ways, we're going to have to draw upon our previous memories to understand what kind of events might occur in the future. Yet at the same time, we are extending our imagination because we're predicting a novel account. And similarly, the reverse kind of thing occurs when you misremember past events. In some ways, this is a process of memory recall that involves sharpening the precision errors. At the same time, we're also not conjuring something that didn't happen, essentially. So there is some degree of imaginative influence there, and something might be being dampened. And so I'll just think to add, I think comparing this kind of these predictive coding accounts of imagination and memory kind of reveal that kind of broad conceptual account given by people like Clark isn't really kind of doing justice to the fine-grained ways that imagination occurs in human experience and how it can be applied to different situations. So yeah, the basic point is how do you deal with the emerging complexity of imagination in predictive coding account as both plausible but grounded in kind of observations of the external world and other things, other forms of evidence like neuroimaging.
Fantastic, thanks so much. So I think we're just going to go through the panelists and then take notes on and then open things up. So Jimena, if you'd like to go next, thanks so much.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Max and Dan. Yeah, actually, so I had thought of a couple of things to say in relation to imagination and predictive processing. One of them goes pretty much in line with what Dan just said. And the other are more general comments. So let me start by saying something more general about perhaps the excitement about predictive processing, but in a way that talks also to skeptics about predictive processing, because a lot of people might be worried about whether we actually have to go through predictive processing proposed at this kind of predictive accounts, right? Because one first reason to, of course, be excited about PP is the promise that it might provide a unifying theory of neural dynamics, right? And if that's right, we of course need to say something like provide a predictive view of imagination. But the thing is that the prospects of PP providing that unifying account are still not completely clear, right? After all, like the evidence to support that unifying account remains insufficient. So the jury is out on whether it can actually do that. So what can we say to gain the sympathy of the skeptics towards that, right? So my idea was that, well, even when PP might not be a unifying account of neural dynamics, there is at least good evidence that some areas of the brain do feature these predictive mechanisms. And like, given that imagination might be at least partly enabled by those mechanisms, at least something needs to be said about how a predictive account of imagination might look. And we have even more reasons to do that, precisely because PP allows us to incorporate at least some features of at least some kinds of imagination, right? So it might allow us to do justice to the idea that imagination consists in some kind of mental action, for instance, or to the idea that at least some kinds of imagination have a quasi-sensory phenomenology. Now, the other exciting feature of predictive processing is something that Max mentioned and Dan also mentioned, which is that it gives us a perspective regarding the relation between mental states and processes that somehow blurs the line between them, right? Now, there are two ways to go around this. One is like a strong view, according to which, for instance, in this case, the claim was regarding perception, but the idea was that perception just is controlled hallucination, for instance, or it just is some kind of imaginative experience. And if this is what it means to blur the lines between different processes and states, again, some people might be worried about that, might think that that's something to be concerned about because it eliminates distinction that we need to account for our mental lives, right? So to that, I think that we still have some good reasons to be excited because there is a more nuanced view or even more fruitful way of looking at that blurring of the lines perspective, right? Because it might allow us to say something about imagination being active, affective, or sensory, or in turn, it might allow us to say something about perception being active, affective, or imaginative. And this actually takes me back to the worry about the unifying picture and something Dan mentioned, right? Because an interesting question that arises concerns what happens to our understanding of imagination and its heterogeneity, right? So should we adopt an all-encompassing notion of imagination as, for instance, an endogenously generated content, right? Is that sufficient? Is that good? Does it account for the different notions we've been kind of distinguishing in philosophy of imagination? Now, it might be that for different notions of imagination, we need to provide different stories about the mechanisms that enable them, right? And this takes us again back to the unifying account of predictive processing or predictive processing as a unifying account. If we do not want to take that unifying picture, predictive processing might be well suited for part of those stories. It might be well suited for some notions of imagination, but not for others. And even if we do think that that PP can accomplish this unifying picture, the mechanistic story would still differ from one notion of imagination to the other, right? So we do need to say more about the details of how, for instance, the minimization of prediction error leads to the different psychological phenomena that we typically associate with imagination, right? So I was thinking that, well, that means that, for instance, if we want to account for sensory imagination, we might need to put more attention to what it means to have some kind of proxy stimuli that doesn't correspond with actual stimuli. If we want to talk about active imaginative processes or exercises like pretense, we might need to look at models of active inference, or at least emphasize those models. Or when when thinking about the relation between imagination and other mental states, right? We might need to look at details about precision weighting, right? So the different notions of imagination kind of put pressure on saying more about the details of our predictive accounts. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jimena. That was great. Tom, would you like to go next? Thanks.
Yeah. So just to pick up on some of the themes that have already been. So definitely agreeing with this idea that imagination breaks down into lots of different varieties of process, right? So the exact predictive processing story is going to have to differ from case to case and might not even be possible to provide for them. So let me focus on one of them to see if we can help solve the puzzle that Max and Sam have set. So the difficult thing to make sense of is this kind of wild imagining, this kind of radical imagining that seems quite untethered to reality. Now, some of the radical imagining that we do is interestingly rooted in our environment. So think of games of make-believe like kids play, right? So you might think, make-believe that this pencil is a sword and that the tree outside my window is a tower in the sky and that the pet cat is a monster and so on, right? So I think that classifies as kind of, a long way from reality. And those props, the pencil, the tree, the cat, they anchor our imaginative activity, right? And kind of set some rules. So if Max were to imagine that he had the sword, he'd be breaking the rules because look, it's in my hand. Right? That's the prop that determines what the right thing to imagine is. Right? And then people in philosophy of art like Kendall Walton think that all of the kind of artistic practices of adults are kind of continuous with those childhood games of make-believes, that novels and sculptures and paintings and plays are all kind of props in a game of make-believe that set rules for what we should imagine. Now, if you start to think of that type of imagining, at least, as anchored in these physical props, I wonder if that opens up a way to get predictive processing back into the story. It might go something like this. So once you're engaged in this imaginative activity of make-believing that my pencil is a sword, then my imaginative activity can piggyback on a predictive process in perception. So imagine that, consider the possibility that my imagination predicts that the location of the sword is a particular place. Now the game has set the rule that the location of the sword is the location of the pencil. So the error signal I get about the location of the pencil can do the job of an error signal about the location of the sword. So suddenly there is control, right? It is anchored in reality. I am getting feedback. And the way I'm doing that is by taking real feedback, adding this make-believe element and turning that real feedback into an imaginary feedback. Okay. And that's not going to help for the kind of imagining that we do with our eyes closed, but maybe it's interesting that predictive processing could at least get an anchor on one kind of radical imagining, which is actually quite a ubiquitous and important one.
Thanks so much, Tom. That was fantastic. So the things I was going to say have kind of been covered, but I've been sort of stimulated, as it were, by what Tom's just said, which there's something that was in Max's presentation, a quote by Andy Clark, where he said something like, talked about animals being capable of perceiving are kind of set to imagine, right? And that raises the question of, you know, how basic is imagining in the animal kingdom, right? How far up or down the evolutionary ladder do you have to look? Not just evolutionary, but developmental as well. And that got me to thinking along the lines of what Tom was saying, which is that maybe, you know, and one of the things that, as a side note, one of the things that I don't like about a lot of the predictive processing literature on imagination is that it often plays fast and loose with the distinction between imagery and imagination. Right? So it often uses the two terms interchangeably, when in fact you can arguably have imagination or things that you would call imagination in the absence of imagery, and lots of stuff involve imagery that don't count as imagination. But yeah, so this idea that maybe one way of thinking about this is to focus on imaginative activities rather than on a thing, some stuff that we might point to and say this is imagination. And then that got me to thinking, well, actually, maybe there's a way of, and this is stuff that Max and I have developed as well, this idea that if we bring into play enculturation and enculturated predictive processing, then maybe we can think of imagination as or kind of full-blooded activities that we want to give the accolade of being imaginative. We might think of those as things that come in actually pretty high up the ladder, right? Rather than as Andy's quote suggests, comes in right at the bottom, right? So the idea would be that precisely these practices of make-believe, or these potentially very materially extended activities, very interactive, very social activities, might be involved in the kind of quintessential activities that we think of as imagination. Anyway, that was me scrabbling, trying not to repeat too much of what the excellent speakers who've gone before me have said.
So I think we might have something from Mike you wanted to input.
Yeah, thanks. This is really great. I've got tons of questions, but I'll just ask one. Thinking about this problem of ubiquity, which I think is a serious worry, it seems like there's at least two ways to go with this. You can say, well, the stuff that's ubiquitous, that's not actually imagination. The stuff that's imagination is this higher level stuff. And one reason to think that you should go this way is because of aphantasia. People with aphantasia, if it's true that they don't have something like sensory imagination, they should be really bad at sensory processing, but they're not. So maybe it's not imagination that's doing the work. A different way to go to solve the problem of ubiquity would be to say it is imagination, but there are different kinds of imagination, and it's a kind of less interesting sort of imagination. So you might combine this with dual process theories of cognition and say that a lot of this imagination is imagination in the automatic, unconscious, effortless sense. And then you could go with people like Amy Kind and say that's not really the kind that we care about as philosophers. So it seems like those are at least two ways to go. I think this overlaps a bit with what Jimena was saying, I think. Yeah, so I was just wondering what people thought about that. And my more general concern or worry about all of this is just how all of these different things we're talking about mesh together: bottom up versus top down, automatic versus deliberate, endogenous versus exogenous. Do these all line up somehow, or are they all completely independent? That's a lot of stuff. Sorry.
Tom.
Oh, I'll respond. That's all right. I think there is something to Clark's account about the potential ubiquity of imagination, because if the account is kind of right, then almost any precision weighting of any particular feed forward or feedback signal is a kind of imaginative process. And then you're dampening your brain filling in the gap somewhere else on purpose. So it's not, I don't like the phrase controlled hallucination, but there is potentially the sense in which if you take the predictive coding account as reductive, then everything to a degree is imagination if you construe a particular way, but only some things manifest themselves as imagination in our conscious thought. So, the example of you're in a very busy room and it's crowded and there's lots of noise, some of your friend speaks to you and then you zone in on that speaking. You may well suddenly just start imagining what everyone else is saying, as a blank sheet of noise, but you might not construe that as imagination if it's still an unconscious process. And so I think there is an important sense to separate the notion of ubiquity from the sense in which that predictive coding has to provide an account for every single kind of imagination we have, and not the sense of predictive coding kind of suggests that our notion of imagination might be much broader than our identification of particular instances of it.
Tom, did you want to follow up on that? And then Jimena.
Yeah, sure. So just picking up on Mike's last point about how all these different distinctions fit together. So I think one thing that's clear from the discussion is that it's really messy, right? And I wonder if that's part of the problem, right? So I feel like a lot of our mental concepts, including the concept of imagination, is kind of based on a kind of naive classical picture of the mind, which the predictive processing framework overturns, right? And when you throw out the classical picture, that means you end up with a terminological mess where it's no longer clear what counts as imagining and what doesn't, right? So it seems like we shouldn't really think, what deserves the label imagining in this new world order. We should just think the label imagining is based on the old world order. And actually what we need to do is just taxonomize things well, identify the similarities and differences between different types of process. And then which one we call imagining, it doesn't really matter, right? Maybe I wonder how much the terminological question might confound the discussion.
Jimena?
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I don't know if we should expect a similar turn to what happens in the case of perception, where, well, we might talk about sensory motor processing, right? There are times where it's useful to speak about perceptual experience or about perception, and these two levels or kinds of discourse or picture one may have sometimes overlap, sometimes they don't. but they need to be kept. So I'm not entirely sure about which strategy to follow, whether to keep the, I'm going to use that label right now, the personal level talk about imagination and all the different kinds of imagination we've come to distinguish and study and say a lot about, but also about, and I'm going to use this other label, talk about the endogenously generated content in a similar way when we talk about sensory motor processing and perception or perceptual experience. The picture is a lot more complicated because we do accept like, no, imagination is this heterogeneous concept, right? So I have no idea. I'm really wondering about that.
So Sam, and then we've got a question from Luke.
Thanks. So I want to pick up on something from Mike and then from Tom. So that was really great. So aphantasia is super interesting because it pinches Andy Clark from both sides, right? So what's problematic, or at least the kind of that Clarkian view, whereby you've got imagination, that's this very basic ubiquitous thing that's involved in perception and pretty much any kind of phenomenal consciousness. In that people, as you rightly point out, people with aphantasia aren't bad at sensory processing, right? So that pinches it from that angle, namely that imagination can't be intrinsically involved in sensory perception. But also, people with aphantasia, I mean, one of the some of the aphantasia data that's particularly interesting is how, wow, well, these people kind of didn't know that they had aphantasia, right? So they're remarkably unimpaired, right? And they're not unimaginative human beings, right? So it also pinches it at this other level where, well, there's kind of the kind of imagination that is very sensorially rich, but then there's like loads of imagination that does all of the stuff we want imagination to do, that they can do, right? So I kind of liked the way that you mentioned aphantasia, and it's definitely worth thinking about. And then that kind of ties in with something that Tom said about the, I loved your way of putting it, with the imagination as a kind of thing, as a concept is sort of belongs to the old world order. And what predictive processing does is it brings in a new world order. Now, what I was wondering is if we don't just bin imagination if we adopt PP. We just say, well, look, at the kind of factual neural level, there's just this kind of messy picture, and it's all this kind of hierarchical Bayesian stuff going on, right? But also, we're social human beings who use language, right? And so we talk about imagination, and we talk about people, you know, being imaginative, for example, right? And that's not just that's not a thin concept, right? When you say that somebody's imaginative, that's like an accolade, right? That's like a value-laden term. And so I like this idea that there's this old world order, but with the bringing in of the new world order, what you kind of have is you have this kind of socially distributed software and the predictive processing hardware, and they sort of operate independently, except the predictive processing potentially has the resources to explain social cognition, linguistic cognition, all that. So yeah, anyway, I'll shut up now.
So Luke, I think, had something to raise.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, I guess, a bit about this new world order that's coming in. So I thought Max was right to point out that many forms of imagination are deliberate in some distinctive way. And I guess that made me wonder in general how predictive processing makes sense of deliberate mental action, particularly mental action that doesn't issue in any bodily action and is just about, well, now I'm going to think about this, now I'm going to ponder this question, or, you know, tell myself this story or whatever. Because I don't feel like I've ever heard people tell me what the predictive processing account of that is. I've heard things about like the predictive processing account of of bodily action, that it's you predict your body's about to move and then it does. And that's, I can at least see how that's going, although I also see potentially some difficulties. But I don't even really know what the predictive processing account of like abstract mental action would be. So maybe people can help me out with that.
Tom.
Yeah, just to say, so when I was talking about this New World Order, I'm not actually on board with this New World Order. I'm just thinking hypothetically. So I would like to echo Luke's question. How on earth could this inaccurate framework make sense of abstract mental actions? So yeah, I'm with you, Luke.
Good. So I think we've got another. Well, I'd just quickly like to say, even though I'm part of the New World Order, that's just a really weird thing to say. That's sort of a problem we think is a big problem for predictive processing. Sort of this notion that you've still got a Cartesian puppeteer doing all the deciding what you're going to be doing in your head, and presumably a framework like this doesn't want to have these extra like homunculi sitting around doing all the controlling of the hierarchy. Anyway, I'll shut up. I couldn't resist. Margarita.
So yeah, thanks. I mean, I don't remember exactly what I was about saying, but yeah, I'd like to come back to a thing that has been said. I mean, Jimena suggested this idea, no? Maybe we should have different stories about different varieties of the imagination or different things that we call imagination. This is related to what Mike also was suggesting. And these also tie to what Tom suggested, or apparently this idea that maybe we should get rid of imagination, because I mean, maybe in the new world that we don't need the imagination, but still, this is also connected to what I guess Max was saying, I mean, and Sam was saying, in which respect we think that to what extent imagination is a basic notion. And, you know, in the literature on imagination, some people are trying to reduce imagination to other stuff, belief, desires, perceptions, like Langland Aston view. And so, of course, if you take this route, of course, you have another way, you can approach differently, you know, how PP can address the imagination. But you think that imagination is still a building block of our mental landscape. I do think that actually we need to account imagination, require imagination with its own varieties within the PP framework. But then, so my question is again, what about not really the unity, but really, are we really able to have an explanation of imagination that makes imagination less mysterious, which is the question Max suggested. Because it seems to me that actually we are reframing the problems, but we have the same problems, that precisely imagination is not just mental imagery, that imagination is not just sensory imagination, what about imagination in different mental contexts and activities? And so we have really the same problems, but we are using another language to address those problems. But maybe we are not really advancing in the explanatory power of our language in order to really explain what imagination is. So, I mean, I hope this is clear enough, or all the things I've tried to connect.
Panelists, Sam, and then Tom.
So that was great. And I think this, something you said about explanatory power really chimed with me, and is something that has regularly upset me about predictive processing. There's a sense in which I work within that framework sometimes, and I think it is useful for answering some very carefully posed questions. Is it good for answering all questions, all of my explanatory concerns? Certainly not. Just like, you know, physics doesn't answer questions about stock market crashes. And I think Jimena made a really good point as well, which is that, you know, responsibly used, predictive processing can be used as a tool for unpacking or demystifying certain kinds of imagination. I think if we start to think about, if we just think that we're going to be able to answer all of our questions just within predictive processing, then we're going to be sorely disappointed. But what we don't want to be doing is making claims that actively go against predictive processing. But then again, often we'll be working at such a level that it's unlikely to impose constraints at the lower level. And I guess that makes me think about what Luke was saying and the Cartesian puppeteer, and the need for enculturation. And then all you say then at that point is, well, yeah, I mean, maybe it is all prediction error minimization, but that's not that interesting once I've moved to thinking about agency, or once I've moved to thinking about socially distributed notions, any more than you can say, hey, well, my economic theories are totally in line with Newtonian physics. And people are like, well, yeah, so what, right? But yeah, anyway, so I think we need to be, when talking about these new world orders and whether we're down with predictive processing or not, there are more or less moderate positions, I guess. I think there are people who are like, well, this is useful for thinking about very certain, clearly defined things. But for people who just want to go, hey, it's all free energy minimization. Anyway, yeah, thanks.
Tom, did you have?
Yeah, I was just going to agree, really, just that problem that sometimes predictive processing approaches rephrase questions rather than answer the question. So just kind of have this feeling there is a risk of that for at least some of this. Just to echo it.
Dan, something to add?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd add though is that this problem kind of echoes like the eliminativist dilemma in the 80s, where you want to reduce or translate your talk of mental concepts down to some, sort of lower level. And then you kind of identify in one situation, and then the critics go, oh, well, what about this, this, and this? You haven't dealt with the complexity of a phenomenon such as imagination. And you kind of, in the end, you're kind of expanding the concept more and more to defeat the original point that maybe that the kind of, in a taxonomical sense, the kind of imagination is proving less useful. And so what I'd say is that the point to make predictive coding isn't to say that cases of imagination are this. It's to provide a kind of bridge between our neuronal understanding of the phenomenon and the actual concept itself. So when you say that, a case of imagination are this dampening of precision weighting signals in certain area, you can then map or localize this onto a certain area of the brain. If it's higher up in the hierarchy, it may well be higher up in physical cognitive areas of the brain in which the operation takes place. And so you provide this kind of bridge to translate your talk of certain concepts to talk of the physical brain itself, but without making the overt jump that might be kind of impossible in the short term, considering our limited abilities to investigate the brain. But I think that's important to consider, is that I don't think predictive processing theorists right now are suggesting the explanation for everything, just that they have a meaningful framework which to translate these explanations of conceptual phenomena using this framework into potentially more fine-grained and useful ways of talking about the brain itself.
I think we got a question from Eduardo.
Hi guys, my questions are probably going to be quite basic. First, Sam, you mentioned that you're thinking about coupling predictive framework with social embeddedness or situatedness, and I was thinking if that's connected to the problem of finding what kind of error would be relevant for imagination going on. So if that's the case, would you consider that an author writing a novel, trying to think about how to make a scene, would be trying to make as immersive to create a surprise reaction or impression reaction or scatological reaction, etc. So in that case, well, that's about that, if that's a connection. And another, if you think that predictive processing is such a basic level mechanism, do you think they need to translate all kinds of imagination to one understanding of how this process could go? Or you could say like, okay, social cognition could go this way, social imagination could go this way, and semantic imagination could go this way, because it's such a low level process that you could add a lot of details and construct very different mechanisms in the higher levels? Yeah, sorry.
No, don't say sorry, because the short answer is yes to pretty much everything you've said. The longer answer is yeah. So I think that the kind of move towards kind of more externalistic predictive processing, usually kind of through active inference or free energy frameworks, is you basically move from the kind of the initial vanilla predictive processing idea where organisms use models of their environment to the idea that organisms are models of their environment, right? And so then what you have is you've got, what neurons in the history of the universe have done is that they've allowed organisms to be models of their environment at rapid timescales, right? But the fact that my hand looks like this, right, is just that very same thing, but over very, very, very long timescales, right? And so the kind of social and enculturated element is just that, but like spread out across different things. So you'd have people, as you put it, right, looking for surprisal or free energy or whatever, not in what have traditionally been thought of as cognitive systems, but in kind of extended social systems or abstract systems, right? So there are people who are like, I mean, this is more Bayesian than predictive processing, but it's consistent. People who model language change by looking at things like, how does a language in the abstract change over time in order to be maximally learnable? So yeah, basically, I should have stuck with the short answer. That yeah, what you would end up doing is looking for free energy minimization, but in material, environmental, social context rather than you could even, there's Abby Tabor is she in Bristol actually? Bath, Bristol, anyway.
She's at University of West of England now, yeah.
Yeah, right. So she does a fascinating stuff that kind of brings together architecture and predictive processing.
And chronic pain.
And pain.
I saw her lecture once.
Okay, cool, awesome.
Any other panelists want to chime in on that? We've got probably time for one more question. Mike has another question.
Thanks, and sorry for abusing this by asking 2 questions. So I was thinking about Luke's question about deliberative imagination and other deliberative mental processes. My first reaction was to think maybe predictive processing is one of those things that's useful for explaining the basic evolutionary story of what the brain does, why it's good to have a brain. And that's going to work across different species. And that's not exactly in conflict with the idea that the brain could be used in other ways, in more idle moments. And I was thinking maybe there's actually some evidence for that in the default mode network. So that's a network in the brain that's activated when we're sitting around doing nothing, but also when we're imagining the minds of others, or if we're telling stories or comprehending stories. All of that activates the default mode network. What doesn't activate the default mode network is active tasks, perception tasks, kind of doing irregular stuff. And it seems like that's where predictive processing is really good. So it seems like at least there's these 2 different kind of general architectures, perhaps, or at least maybe this is something that suggests that there is. And if you look at people who have deficiencies in the default mode network, people with Alzheimer's, very serious depression, people with autism, they can do all of the regular stuff that predictive processing is really good at explaining. But the stuff that the default mode network seems to enable, which seems like the more deliberative stuff, sometimes they can have trouble with those sorts of things. So maybe there's some reason to believe that we can kind of separate the predictive processing framework into places where it works really well and places where it's not so well equipped. Just an idea.
So Dan, yeah.
Yeah, so what I will say is that there has been a recent trend in literature and predictive coding into talking about, I guess, what you could call exploratory behavior. And that it's important to remember that when you're talking about prediction error minimization, at least in like a mathematical sense, that it's long term over time. Is that it's not meant to be that every single kind of second you're then predicting minimized prediction error. Instead, as the depth and complexity of a model grows to the level of human being, you're engaging in kinds of prediction error minimization or free energy minimization that occur across, incredibly long timescale, perhaps even the timescale of an entire human life. And part of this is kind of exploratory behavior, as in, when you go outside and you're particularly testing your model against new experiences or sensory data. And this kind of does include also your own thoughts. One useful way to test your predictions about, say, your emotional state is to think about the different array of emotions you might feel in a different situation and see what kind of things that brings. And so when you are, encountering a similar situation in the future in which those emotional states arise, you've already predicted to a certain extent what you might feel and so on. And so I think it's just important to kind of think about in abstract thought is that there's not a particularly convincing overall explanation, but there is this important idea of exploratory behavior, which governs why we do more complex actions in our lives, at least from a predictive coding framework.
Tom, did you have a hand up or no?
No.
Anyone want to have any final thoughts before we wrap up? Sam?
Sorry, this certainly doesn't have the status of a final thought, but it was something that Dan said that I really liked, and also sort of by way of apology, because there was a point where I felt like I was saying that there are all of these crazy people who think that predictive processing explains everything, and that was definitely a straw man, right? But there are people who are quite narrow-mindedly just working on narrow-mindedly is too negative a term, but they do just work on predictive processing. And but what I wanted to pick up on was this idea that if you put your philosopher of science hat on and look at predictive processing, you think to yourself, well, what exactly is the status of predictive processing? What is its explanatory power? What does it actually do? I think Dan said something really valuable, which is that it's a good bridge between different ways of thinking and between different levels or different kinds of vocabulary. And that speaks also to its emergence, right? So what's interesting is if you look at predictive processing as a thing that emerged, it's not just what you actually got was you got a convergence from people working in lots of different areas, right? So you had psychiatrists looking at psychosis and dopamine, and you had computational modelers, and you had biologists, and they were all just like, oh, actually, you know what? We're kind of like talking about the same sort of thing. And the convergence of it is something that people have found exciting, but also the way in which it seems like there's a kind of consilience that you can get between things that were thought completely bridges that were thought unbridgeable, like, for example, neurobiology and phenomenology, right? So the idea that you could, if you think of, you observe that if you put loads more dopamine in somebody's brain, then they start to have psychotic symptoms. And you're like, right, well, what is the link between like dopamine and the phenomenology of psychosis, right? Well, predictive processing comes in and says, well, look, what dopamine does is that it, ups the gain on your prediction errors. And so everything's going to start to feel more salient, and it's going to draw your attention. And people who've experienced psychosis go, oh yeah, that really rings true, right? And then suddenly you find that you have sort of bridged something that was deemed unbridgeable. So yeah, just to say that its status as a bridge rather than as an explainer of everything is kind of nice.
Thanks everyone, that's been amazing. I've learned lots. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have. Round of applause to our fantastic panelists and to everyone who asked wonderful questions. So we've got a few minutes before Tom has to go straight from being a panelist to giving a talk. Sorry, Tom. And I think it's time to get a cup of tea, possibly, or afterwards. I'd just also like to highlight that the break after this is officially a tea break and not a coffee break, as the others are advertised in the schedule. So back at 5 past.